Oh yeah, that's true. I didn't know. My fault. Yeah, 278. 278. Oh wait. No, it was 280. 280. Sorry. Right? Bosnia in the 90s, right? Where's Yugoslavia? What happened to Yugoslavia? I wonder what happened to them. Huh. I wonder what happened to them. And the Congolese people, and like even in this book, like how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You know what I mean? How did that happen, I wonder? They took and stole and pillaged Africa. And so like what are we talking about? Yeah, that's capitalism, buddy. If you know, that's capitalism. Good try. Anyways, let's get to the reading. Wild. All right, I'm gonna go back a paragraph just so I can remember where I'm at. All right. So, an anti-colonial movement as a whole, most of which was non-socialist, must be given credit for reopening the discussion on development and transition. A discussion which first appears in explicit fashion with the emergence of the Soviet Union after the First World War. Interesting enough, the heightened consciousness of change in the post-colonial world gave rise to an African journal with the name Transition, which was once extremely popular among the intelligentsia on that continent. The reoccurrence of the title in Guyana is more than just coincidence. It attests to a similarity of objective and subjective conditions from the rapid dissolution of aspects of the old order of colonialism forces considerations of the possibilities of qualitatively changed societies. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the debate of social transformation has been extended to virtually every part of the globe, but it has not necessarily been made more penetrating. On the contrary, transition and development have been given the vaguest of definitions, and the urgency of revolution has been muted into indistinguishable from the timelessness of evolution. In part, these tendencies have to do with lack of clarity in defining the stage of advanced imperialism that has come to prevail, while above all the stem from bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie class interpretations of the historical stages which lie ahead. All classes and strata within the anti-colonial nationalist movement identify alien domination as a negative feature within the world society, which has in the process of dissolution. Nationalist class elite alliances have vitally demolished the old practical superstructure of global imperialism. Beyond this point, there can be no unanimity at the national level. The presence of conflicting cases of developing world countries means that there can be no agreement on identifying capitalism and imperialism as a sustaining element of the world order. Vested interests, therefore, inevitably deny that transition and development necessitate the demise of capitalism and imperialism. It is the contention here that exploitative classes presuppose pseudo-solutions to the problems of development. There is no real problematic of transition outside the framework of the transition to socialism. The working class solution offers a revolutionized society. All other proposals modify and extend to greater or lesser degree the system of production and reproduction based on the commoditization of labor power and the alienation of surplus labor. Oh, it's just asking if you want to. For a minute there, I thought Madeline Pennant came in. The post-colonial world is too differentiated to be reduced to any single neo-colonial stereotype. Nevertheless, at one end of the spectrum, there is the classic neo-colonialism of states which have barely altered their political military dependency on the former colonized powers, and which have strengthened their ties with international capitalism on the conventional basis of private ownership of the means of production. In such instances, for example, Malaysia, Zaire, Trinidad, and Tobago, I can't say it. Tobago. The departure of the colonial administration has been followed by rapid reconstruction of the local bourgeois and petty bourgeoisie into transnational capitalist production. Technology transfers, moderate shifts in international division of labor, and the increased hegemony of the U.S. and Japan are some of the novel features of the classical neo-colonial tendencies. But of course, the result is the intensification of something which is centuries old, namely capitalist accumulation on a global scale. For the rest of this analysis, attention will be focused only on those conditions and strategies which at least offer the appearance that they mark the beginning of the new social era. In several developing world countries, the ideal of a mixed economy, quote unquote, has been presented in a very attractive format. A private sector, a state-owned sector, a sector of joint ventures would assure the best of both worlds and would itself constitute a new entity defined as socialism as a special type. See the works of Leopold Ségur, for instance. The fact that these ideas have been most adherently propounded by the ruling class in the countries such as Senegal and Singapore is far from reassuring, given that these two states function integrally and comfortably within the imperialist framework. Rather, the political leadership of Senegal and Singapore had any intentions of building socialism is highly debatable, but conscious intentions apart, the transition to socialism could not have been affected by a new piddling measure of government participation in an economy that remained firmly located within the international capitalist system. So they're saying even the two types, the democratic, thank you, Pizza, glad you're here. The democratic socialist entities, they said were still firmly located within the participation in the global international capitalist system. So they still adhere to capitalism. They still adhere to exploitation, and they also stifle the capacity for the workers to go fully and thoroughly through the revolutionary process to emancipate themselves from any type of exploitation. The mixed economy, quote unquote, is at best a local fallacy when it is not a deliberate smokescreen for bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie class interests. Transition must necessarily have mixed features of capitalist relics and embryonic socialism, but the latter, democratic socialism, would exist in a position of dominance. The capitalist part would exist in a position of dominance, yes. Transformation would therefore involve the inextricable replacement of the last legacies of capitalism. A number of developing world countries have declared themselves adherent or discoverers of one species of socialism or another, where there is a verbal commitment to the transitions to socialism. It requires greater scrupulousness to see whether what is proposed is indeed transition. Tanzania Ujaman socialism is one of the more revealing experiences. The Socialist Assura Declaration was announced some 12 years ago in 1967. The implementation has been carried out by the government, which commands respect in the developing world, and a significant body of literature has accumulated on Ujamaa socialism. One of the most recent and carefully documented studies of Ujamaa villages collectives in Tanzania cast serious doubt on whether the process of socialist transition has yet been initiated within the countryside. The principal reason for this adverse judgment are as follows. Point 1. The low level of production and productivity of the agriculture cooperatives, that is Ujamaa farms. Point 2. The stagnation of regression of the cooperative sectors in attracting labor. Point 3. The failure of the co-ops to provide the basis of improved agriculture technology. And the last point, the bureaucratization.
To see what's
rather than the democratization of decision making in the villages. The researchers, Mampulu and Philipson located the fundamental problems not within the villages themselves, but in the political framework, which is not firmly based on those classes with the greatest objective interest in transformation. That is, the peasantry and the working class. The question of productive forces, social organizations, ideology, state, and class were all touched upon in an attempt to explain why socialist development / transformation had failed to get underway in Tanzania instance. The premises of the assessment were made explicit. And here, I think here's what it is. Since the development of the productive forces specifically includes the development of a general ability of the producers themselves, cooperation should enable progressive ideas to take root more firmly in all aspects of peasant life, and through cooperative self-management and discussion and decisions making, give the direct producer more control over the state apparatus at the local level, thus enhancing their participation in running the economy at a national level. Cooperation takes on its class characteristics from the general strategy of development in which it is inserted, which is in turn an expression of the interests of the ruling class or alliance of classes in each particular social formation. Thank you. The lower level of production and the rate of progress in rural Tanzania cannot be explained outside an analysis of existing social structures and of the matter in which the economy is linked to the international capitalist economy. Hence the fact, so they still maintain contact with the capitalist. Okay, they still maintain contact. So that's the bad part. That's the big huge contradiction. Hence the fact that this particular policy has not proved to be a substantial basis upon which improvement in rural production could be generated or arises from the failure of the policy to address itself to the fundamental problems of social structures and economic integration. In essence, therefore, the issue is really political. To be able to sufficiently mobilize and organize the masses in a manner which would extricate the economy from its domination and exploitation by international capitalism requires a class base of an ideological perspective which hardly a single African government can be credited with at present. And that's in 1970s, around there. The contingent formulation above allows us to advance the understanding of transition with particular reference to its political facets. The necessity for social change in the developing world arises out of the conjecture of contradictions in the system of capitalism/imperialist production. But the appreciation of this necessity and its historical implementation requires a political organization of those social classes with an objective interest in the overthrowing of capitalism and the creation of a society freed from the exploitation of labor. The leap from evolution within capitalism to evolution within socialism is no mere spontaneous process. It involves changing levels of consciousness, building working class organization and self-discipline, and above all, the revolutionizing of the state and hence the character of all subsequent social and political interventions. Yeah. The struggle for national independence often nurtured euphoric hopes that in the post-independence period, national development would virtually take care of itself. Quote, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all things else will be added hitherunto," end quote, was the famous dictum of Kwame Nkrumah. It presupposed that the contradiction which undermined colonialism and which therefore forced imperialism to alter its political form would also force an alteration of its social, culture, and economic subsistence. However, imperialism has proved itself far more powerful and resilient in the periphery than had been suggested in interpretation of moribund capitalism, quote unquote. The local petty bourgeoisie comprador class became more and more marginalized after independence. Such a context was hardly perpetuous for initiating transition, and the developing world states aimed at modifying the international division of labor so as to promote the indigenous bourgeoisie and of labor so as to promote an extermination of the development plans of the great majority of independent African and Caribbean states disclosed almost identical provisions for neutering domestic private capital. Yeah. And the growth of indigenous capital has been registered in all developing world countries alongside the pauperization. Let's look at what pauperization is, because it's paupers. Pauperization. Let's look that up. Look up pauperization. I have it on me. Come on. There we go. P-A. And it's going so slow. There we go. U-P-E-R. Rization. Come on. Oh my gosh. I have to close the app. Hold on. Jesus. It's not letting me do it. Why are you giving me problems? Oh my gosh. I need the S, buddy. I need the A. And here we go.
Pauperization.
Pauperization, a process of making a person or a group very poor. Impoverishment. Okay, cool. I get it now. Of the workers, peasants, and the lumpen proletariat. The emergence of the indigenous bourgeoisie may create tension with respect to the establishment of multinational capitalists. Yet, the new class in the periphery contributes to the reproduction of capital and the capitalist social relations on the global south, on a global scale. The coming into being of such a class has been welcomed by institutions such as the World Bank, and one has grave difficulties in identifying the strategies of indigenous capitalist growth with any variant of socialism whatsoever. Non-Marxian versions of socialism often deny the existence of classes, or at any rate deny the central dynamic imparted to society by antagonistic class contradictions. Even seemingly anti-imperialist leadership, as in Ghana and Tanzania, has espoused this position. Meanwhile, the reality has been that the petty bourgeoisie has consolidated itself as a class, a program of development which denies the independent existence of the working class and the peasantry, is unable to mobilize these classes in their own interests or to make them the leading classes within the state. Conversely, the same denial of class formation enables the petty bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie to take state control, first surreptitiously and then brazenly, on the abscess of their greater sense of organization during the nationalist phase of anti-colonial struggles. And that's why nationalism, when we do national liberation, it must not seek to come into a phase of bourgeoisie. It must seek to be internationalist, and also seek to have, and to seek socialism. The option which the petty bourgeoisie and aligned strata may pursue, the relation of international capital, vary from joint ventures of the nationalization of foreign and domestic capital. Obviously, there is a difference between the uninhabited private enterprises in Trinidad or Morocco and the attempted state ownership of Guyana, and Algeria. So this one's like Guyana. However, it is quite remarkable how the instances of state intervention have failed to produce any substantial improvements in living patterns as far as the mass of direct producers are concerned. Even more remarkable is the tendency towards instant reversal of such progressive objectives as might have been secured by the nationalist mass base at an earlier period. A progressive foreign policy, for instance, has been known to change into its opposite virtually overnight. Transition is movement in a given direction. It is not a shuttle service. Yeah, okay. Yet ownership of the means of production has been transferred from private hands to the state and then back again to private hands. In Indonesia, in Egypt, in Ghana, one could say that objectively, the period of state ownership merely served to guarantee that some sections of indigenous population would be better prepared to undertake the role of small and medium-sized private capitalists in the era of the multinational giants. There is one particularly troubling question in evaluating those, quote, progressive, end quote, countries that differ in some respects from classic neo-colonial states. Have they begun to chart a new course which is anti-imperialist, non-capitalist, or is it what they represent, socio-political formations which capitalism can accommodate and welcome? Advanced sectors of French capitalism is quite reconciled to the Algerian, quote, experiment, end quote. The World Bank funds its useful and to allocate with Tanzanian petty bourgeoisie. North American mining capital has given the stamp of approval in Guinean's regime.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. And with respect to Guyana, the American state ignores the application of its own recently designed, quote, human rights criteria. The implication is that imperialism has not yet been stretched to the limit of its potential. It will accommodate states that have taken steps against foreign private property in response to internal and external forces, provided the new judicial property relations affect neither the long-term contributions of the country to global capitalist accumulation, and provided the state continues to guarantee class differentiation. The crucial variable is the composition of the state. In any good developing world country, it is at least arguably transitional, when the classes and strata which were preeminent in the colonial period began to lose their control over the means of production and the state. To put it another way, the movement towards socialism demands a prior constitution of the working class into the state, as that the state would increasingly affect the role of the working class in production. States with different class bases may occur with respect to some policies of national development. Changes in international economy, for instance, are being advocated by the developing world nations. The accumulating petty bourgeoisie occurs with realists among the leading bourgeois spokesmen, who admit that the old international order cannot survive with the same form and content. Hence the call for a new international economic order and for the initiating of a so-called North/South dialogue. In effect, the strains of imperialism in its present stage demand partial change if there is to be a new lease of life. Marxists and working class intellectuals have long called for revamping the international economic order. They have claimed to have been more resolute and consistent in the working for such changes, and have realistically pressed for the best of the short-term arrangements, even within the structures set up by the agreements such as the Limo Convention. However, working class objectives are more far-reaching than those adjustments that give breathing space to accumulating classes on the periphery of capitalism. After all, it is from the perspective of alienated labor in the developing world that the operations of the old international order are most intolerable. It is only the working class state that will revolutionize social production within its own boundaries and simultaneously contribute to the final dismissal of global imperialism. By implications, the leap towards socialism is inseparable from the conscious intentions of working class leaderships made manifested through the state. All historical leaps have not been consciously directed. On the contrary, passages from one mode of production to another previous to socialism have been the result of forces that were improperly understood even by the main classes in the drama. The bourgeois class could hardly have been said to have directed any early formations of capitalist societies. Socialism is unique because of the highly developed consciousness of the two combatant classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Social relations in the developing world countries today cannot be changed independently of men's will. Conscious discussions, have to be taken to change the forces of productions, including the size and skill and composition of the working class, the relations of production and the mediation of those relations by the state. Of course, quote, conscious intentions, end quote, means much more than mere statements of ideological declamations. Verbal adherence to Marxism in Congo, Brazzaville, Guinea, Somalia, and Ethiopia has accompanied social development indistinguishable from those in states where there has been an explicit rejection of the theory of class contradictions. That is to say, Marxist intellectuals have been silenced workers. Representatives have been eliminated, and the working class as a whole excluded from democratic participation in social reconstruction. For transition to have validity, it must include the widespread promotion of socialist education without caricature, and it must rest firmly on workers' democracy. The contradictions within the imperialist system and between imperialism and socialism provide the objective basis for the passage of socialism in independent capitalist countries. This has to be reiterated and then qualified by the equally important variable of action by class-conscious elements. Transition therefore equates with guided transformations. It means social policies directed by the working class in its own interest. Broad and challenging possibilities are opened up by the notion of workers' democracy, which has relevance both at the point of production and within several levels and branches of the state. It should also be clear that such transitions should allocate meaningful roles of strata, which are closely and potentially allied to the working class all above the peasantry, as well as independent craftsmen, shopkeepers, and lower solitariat. What is that? Students, I'm gonna look up this word. Salariat. I can't say the word. Open. So we're gonna find out what it means. Right back. Hold on a second. Salariat. Never heard of this word, and it's not gonna let me say it. Oh, it is. Yay. Salariat. Salaried white-collar workers. Okay. Students, technocrats, and other intellectuals. The scope of the present discourse does not permit elaboration of the complex interrelated problems that have to be resolved once the process of transition is underway. In the final analysis, comprehensive answers will be forthcoming through social practice and attempted transformation. That is the section on transformation, on transition. So we should be aware of these transitions and what transitional periods need to take place to bring on the complete the full transition into socialism. And also it'd be good to recognize the transition from like how capitalism has transitioned into many different phases, from free competition to imperialism, you know what I mean, to all those things, to utilizing colonialism and then neo-colonialism. It's all those, you know what I mean? So, yeah. All right, decolonization, chapter 16. When dealing with such a broad topic in a short time, one automatically runs the risk of being extremely superficial. Consequently, I will concentrate my attention on one particular hypothesis, attempting to draw certain correlations between colonialism and neo-colonialism, and will illustrate the hypothesis with reference primarily in South Africa. If we look at the UN Committee of Decolonization, we find that the committee is concerned at the present time with countries such as the Republic of South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and the French and the Cameroon Islands, and French territories of Afars, and the ISIS of Africa. It's ISSIS of Africa. They are concerned, in other words, with the remnants of formal colonialism. That is what decolonization means in that particular context, to terminate the formal colonial rule of Africa. Many Africans and non-Africans would perhaps say that the subject of past, for certainly that subject is less important and less pressing than the question of what one does with those states. that are nominally independent on the African continent. In other words, for many people living in Africa, in the African continent, the issue is not nearly, or perhaps not principally, freedom from formal colonial rule, but the enlargement of freedom within the states which are judicially independent. And that means, of course, confronting the neo-colonial providence that has been established in the wake of colonialism. My proposition is that those African states which are yet to win their independence, which are yet to be decolonized in the manner in which the UN Committee on Decolonization approaches the subject, are carrying through their struggles of independence at a time when other Africans and other peoples elsewhere are carrying through a struggle against neocolonialism. And this overlap and interpenetration of the existence of colonialism with the existence of neocolonialism clearly affects the character of decolonization in a number of ways. It affects the character of the decolonization of those states, which are still formally non-independent, which are still formerly colonies. And it affects the character of decolonization in those areas which are normally colonies. It is the particular interrelationship of contemporary Africa that I would like to examine briefly. My starting point would be the so-called territories of Portuguese Africa in the 1960s, now the independent countries of Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau. But in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the independence movement were developing in all three of these territories. One of the characteristics discernible in the writings of the leaders such as Amilcar Cabral. Remember Amilcar Cabral? Everybody remember Amilcar Cabral. Very, very pertinent person that sought liberation for the working class in Guinea-Bissau. Before his assassination, before his assassination, Samora Michael in Mozambique, and I'm gonna ruin these names, everybody. Augusto Hu Nato of Angola. One of the characteristics was a concern with looking at those states in Africa which were already nominally independent, but the program for decolonization or liberation for Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, respectively, was, in part, dependent upon the pattern already set by independent African countries. There was a yardstick. Angola could look to Zaire, Mozambique, could look to Zambia, and Guinea-Bissau, could look to Guinea, and it could look to Senegal and ask itself what was happening in these supposedly independent African countries. And rather the pattern of change represented the type of goals, the type of society that they in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique should be struggling for. There was a pattern. There was a blueprint. There was an actual objective historical situation with which they could compare, which did not exist, of course, in the earlier period of decolonization. Then my argument is that what was programmed in Angola and in Guinea-Bissau was in fact determined by the prior access to independence by a number of other African countries, and the illustration of what independence could mean in the African country. You may easily test this for yourself in the writings of the aforementioned political leaders. They could say time and again, our struggle is not merely to replace the Portuguese. Our struggle is not merely to stain the structures of exploitation and replace white maintainers or white supervisors of that structure with black maintainers and the same structure. They could continually indicate that it is more than the need to raise the glass and celebrate a national anthem that the people of Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau were struggling for. And it seems to me that it is a very important dimension of the evolution of thought and action and organization within the liberated territories of that used to be Portuguese Africa. Of course, there are people engaged in armed struggle who are making very often a maximum sacrifice of life, making a sacrifice of limbs, making a sacrifice of being uprooted from their homes. Such people have to be careful in defining goals that would be considered the goals of decolonization. In a previous era, it was permissible and understandable that people merely said we are struggling for independence, which means freedom from the white man's rule. It was permissible, but at a later stage, when this freedom was supposedly achieved in a number of African countries, then the material conditions of life did not radically alter. And then the culture conditions were not radically transformed. And then the social structures, the political structures were merely transformed only insofar as it allowed a new processing class to take control. Then people in other parts of Africa began to wonder whether this was the kind of state and society for which they were making these tremendous sacrifices. And by and large, their answer was no. No one in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau could be mobilized to sustain the tremendous people's war on the basis of simply saying, we want to be like the other African states which have gained their independence. And the deepening of the appreciation of undoubtedly took place in Portuguese Africa was in part dictated by the logic of the armed struggle, but it was also partially influenced by that decolonization supposedly meant in these other parts of Africa. Okay, sure. Thank you. Appreciate that. I believe in Zambia, the institutions is bound to be the same thing. That if, for the sake of argument, in 1964, when Smith unilaterally declared independence on behalf of the white settlers in Rhodesia, if at that date the British had the power and will to organize the transition and the handover to black rule, they would have given the government over to ZANU or ZAPU. They would have given the government over to the masses of Balaliland and Harare, and the pattern which would have emerged in Zimbabwe from 1964 until now could not have been radically different from the pattern that has evolved in Zambia from independence until the present date, because the leadership is from the same social structure. The leadership did not indicate that it had any other ideological presence other than that which others had in Zambia. And the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, the workers, the transient workers, and the permanent workers, and in the farms and mines, were not yet involved as participants in that movement for national independence. And therefore, to my mind, in 1964, the transition to independence, which we may call decolonization, would have meant something radically different from what decolonization means today in the era of neocolonialism. The existence of neocolonialism is there as a guide which transforms the character of the demands of the expectations of those involved as far as decolonization is concerned. So they just transferred it from some of these places from colonialism into neocolonialism. Today, Zimbabwe, I'm going to make sure, Zambabwe. The masses of the population have already involved in part in carrying through a political struggle which had to be sustained while it was illegal. And in carrying through the political struggles that have a very significant armed component, having been raised to the level of an armed people's war, it means that there are so many dimensions which have been enlarged, including primarily the political dimensions and the dimensions of popular participation. So in Zimbabwe, to be decolonized today, it requires, of course, the removal of Smith, as it would have required in 1964. But it requires more than that. It requires that the Zimbabwean people should make certain kinds of choices about the options which are being presented by the leadership. And if, as seems to be the case, most of the leadership which survives the original earlier era has lost touch with the sensibilities and the demands of the Zimbabwean people. In this process of learning, then the leadership automatically becomes outdated, and there will have to be a new leadership, new structures, new demands which reflect the contemporary period. So this is the change that is being wrought in part by the interpretation of the stages of colonialism and neocolonialism. More than that, to the peoples of Zimbabwe, we can add Namibia, and the Republic of South Africa, who are all colonized in the old traditional sense and are also in the position to witness certain changes taking place on the African continent, in which indicate that, after all, the political ruling characteristics of colonialism was only one facet, and at that, a rather superficial element within the pattern of imperialism, and that colonial rule as a political phenomenon was, of course, reflective of much deeper forces of penetration into the African continent, forces which actually intervened in transforming the mode of production within Africa and the transforming the social relations within Africa, forces which went beyond the mere political boundaries as established by the British, the French, the Belgians, Italians, and so on. And today, I believe these forces can be seen more clearly because of the facet of political rule has been removed in many territories, and the reality of economic exploitation exposed for all to see. One can see, for example, that not only with the end of colonialism has there been a clear rise of the forces such as the multinational corporation, acting now as a new link, as the new forms of guaranteeing the export of surplus. But one can see that there has always been an underlying economic partition and a continuing economic partition which has gone on during the colonial period and is even more marked today. And this, again, I believe, gives some new dimensions to what decolonization must mean, because decolonization in the early epoch meant dealing with the political power, which had formal control over one's political system. The British at Westminster controlled the territory. The decolonization meant going to the British and demanding that such political rule be withdrawn. Jesus. But decolonization today means going to these economic command centers of the capitalist world system and recognizing that one has to break the particular character of the connection that exists with those command centers, and therefore enter the United States of America. The U.S. has never been a colonial power in Africa, in the African continent, but always lying somewhat in the shadows, lying somewhat in the background behind French, British, and Belgian colonialism. Now, that's in the 1970s, so now it's different. American capital has emerged in various parts of Africa. Okay, here we go. Of parts of Africa, but particularly in southern sections of Zaire, southward to the Cape behind the cover provided by Portuguese and the Belgians, the British in Rhodesia, and South African government in Namibia and the Republic of South Africa. Take a break real quick. Just how low lives looking for a heart handout. Oh my gosh, you guys are wild. Wild. Okay, no one else. Okay, good. There was a continual process of economic repartition insofar as the United States was constantly gaining at the expense of other colonial powers in their share of the African trade. In this share of the investment in Africa and of the profits which were being repatriated from Africa, is that right? Repatriated from Africa. This process was highlighted by the development of Anglo-American corporations in the interwar years and in the full galaxy of multinational corporations in the post-war era years. The United States has clearly come in a crooked position where it is now hegemonic within this economic partition of South Africa. It has quite clearly taken over from the Portuguese. Quite a while ago, it took over the leadership from the Belgians and the French and the old Congo and the Republic of Zaire. And it has, for a long time, been bolstering the support and supporting the British in the Republic of South Africa, and has clearly taken the lead from the British in South African investments, so that the economic repartition is a very significant element, because the peoples of South Africa today is speaking about decolonization, have not merely to look to their colonial power, or the white settler minority, which is resident. It has to look beyond that and ask what forces sustain the particular mode of production, what sources sustain the mine labor and farm labor, what forces sustain the particular ways in which South Africa is integrated into the capitalist world system, and the principal forces which sustain this happen to reside within the most developed capitalist sectors of this economy, the multinational or transnational sector. The entry of the United States into the diplomatic realm and the political maneuvering around Zimbabwe and around Angola and the Republic of South Africa is ample testimony to the fact that the United States has been focused to assume this hegemony, taking over the political role of policing Southern Africa from the British, who are no longer capable of so doing. It seems to me, then, if we're going to enlarge the meaning of decolonization, one of the most useful way of doing so is precisely to lay side by side these two modalities of colonialism and neocolonialism, and recognize that in the process of carrying through a struggle of decolonization in the formal territories, one is automatically guided by the transition taking place in the continent as a whole, which includes, of course, those areas that are supposed to be independent. I will go further It works the other way. The reverse is also true, that in a territory which is supposedly independent, looking at the total configuration inside of South Africa, where the Africans of South Africa are fighting against apartheid, seemingly against apartheid alone, where the people of Zimbabwe are fighting for independence. Those in the rest of the Africa can well ask themselves, what are the principal contradictions manifesting on our continent today? And they will know those contradictions go far beyond the old formulations of mere political rule. Someone looking at the configuration of South Africa from territories such as Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria, and the like, such an individual must be able to recognize that the confrontation of the contradictions are much broader, much deeper than the confrontations which they themselves in the independent African states might have considered to be the most important during the 1960s. One takes a look at the economic structures to recognize that there is no way to speak about decolonization without talking about the recovery of the national resources, for instance. Yet, the question of recovering the national resources has already only been posed in a period of subsequent to political independence, and it still remains a legitimate concern for decolonization. So, we have to be careful with the use of language here, or we will wrap ourselves in some knots. We now, therefore, have to recognize the continuum of change and recognize that political independence was merely a moment, and perhaps not necessarily a very important moment in a totality of transformation, which we might call decolonization, and that the territory which has achieved political independence, if not necessarily perhaps to lose the terminology of the colony, at the very least we must retain the title of neo-colonial until we can see more fundamental changes take place. And if those changes are going to take place at the level of the economic structures, there are also those of us who would argue that they must automatically take place also within the class structures, because economies of formerly colonial and neo-colonial territories must be sustained by some social mechanism. They don't operate in a vacuum. There are specific social classes which represent, first of all, the links between external capital and the indigenous labor. And there are local classes that are emerging, which are consolidating their own strength vis-a-vis other sectors of the African people, usually by consolidating around the state apparatus and securing the large portions of the goods and services that are being produced within the economy. And therefore, again, because of the conjunctions of stages, one is forced to ask more profound questions than a nationalist or the decolonizer might have asked a decade ago. One has to give a social content of ideological content to the program for decolonization, whereas decolonization was some years ago understood as Africanization. One now has to talk about socialism as an integral part, not a later stage of the very process of decolonization itself. Without speaking about recognizing the class relations within Africa, one is not, in fact, addressing oneself to cutting the reproduction of capitalism as it has produced itself in Africa over the last 5 decades or more. It seems then that when Cabral, who was writing within the period of struggle when he had not yet got rid of formal colonial rule, said, quote, "We regard it as an indispensable prerequisite for national independence, that we should have recovery of our national resources," end quote. He had reached a level of analysis which is only now being reached by many Africans within independent Africa, who had postponed the question of recovery of economic resources as though it were not relevant to the phase of decolonization. But to someone like Amilcar Cabral and to Samora Michael and to, here we go, Agostinho Neto, and hopefully we would see to some of the Zimbabwe nationalists, such as, oh my gosh, here we go, Mugabe. The question of recovery of the national resources is one of the items that has to be placed on the agenda in the present phase of the achievement of political independence. They have to organize political movements which are in themselves more participatory, more representative of the masses of the common people in their own territories. And therefore, at the moment of the conquest of state power, these systems will incorporate an element of participation that will allow the mass of these mobilized cadres to operate in the situation where at least there will be layers of grassroots leadership, perhaps with both political education as well as the arms which may be necessary to combat the deformation that takes place under neocolonial domination. To be concrete, let's look at the example of free limo, which is FRELIMO. Let's find out what that means. Free limo. We're about to find it out. I'm going to put it all in capital. Yeah, they keep joining back and forth. Am I having problems with the internet? Thank you. Looks like I'm not having problems. No one said anything. So yeah. Hey, Avery. I don't know if they're here yet. I didn't see them. Oh well. F. Oh, it might be free the land, the Republic of New Africa. Oh wait, no, that's not it. That's not it. What is this at? What is this? It is a democratic socialist political party in Mozambique. It has governed the country since its independence from Portugal in 1975, founded in 1962, began as a nationalist movement fighting for self-determination and independence of Mozambique from the Portuguese colonial rule. Okay, cool. This was a system which did not initially conquer the state power of the Portuguese. Rather, it began to create and initiate systems of political participations and political organizations of civilian administrations in the liberated areas which are least represented, a counter to the alienation which one would find when you inherit the state structures that was left by the colonialists, so that I can assure that when one inherits the state structures of colonialism, one merely becomes a tool of that colonialism. That is not that such a structure can become the tool of independent Africans, but rather the structure becomes the determinant of the African rulers, become mere participants in the same type of capitalist and authoritarian structures. And that's the whole reading of smashing the systems and creating a new, destroying the system all completely and creating creating something new that represents the people. That is the people. The people create it. It seems to me that in those parts of Africa which are still struggling for independence, they have the opportunity to give these lessons from so-called independent Africa, from neo-colonial Africa, to deal with issues which have not at all been posed to the earlier phase. And I conclude with a look at the independent states which are aiding the liberation movement in South Africa. One rough yardstick that indicates that the level of extent to which an African state has been decolonized in any profound way is the extent of which to which that African state is capable of entering into a meaningful relations with the liberation movements. That is to say, outside of South Africa, it is not an accident that the most conservative, the most reactionary states are the ones which have constantly failed to give any meaningful support to the liberation movements. They all start from the premise of national liberation, yet they are incapable of and unwilling to give support to the liberation movements. They are the ones who always drag their feet with regard to contributions to the OAU Liberation Committee. They are the ones that always put obstacles in the way of any of the more progressive sectors of the liberation movements. They are the ones who, around Angola, prevaricated and delayed and manipulated to try and avoid the recognition of the NPLA and instead to introduce the government which incorporated UNITA and the FNLA as spokesmen of the imperialist interests, so that one can use this almost as a touchstone, the formal independent African states. What attitude does it take towards the independent states that are struggling for formal colonialism? To them, if Southern Africa were to become independent in exactly the same way that Zambia and Kenya is independent, then that is good enough. I spoke, for example, with the representatives of the OAU Liberation Committee, who said at the time when it was clear that the Portuguese were about to be defeated, that as far as they are concerned in Mozambique, the task of the Liberation Committee was at an end. At an end, yeah. They couldn't care less to whom the Portuguese gave independence, because the Portuguese were maneuvering to try to give independence to some other organization in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, and in Angola too. And this official was saying that it was okay with him. He said, quote, "We are not concerned with who is going to rule and how they are going to rule. We are only concerned with freedom that is decolonization," end quote. Such officials and such elements of the African ruling class as independent African countries would prefer to see an independence that is merely nominal, because the Mozambique that Frelimo, FRELIMO, is striving for, I'm sorry everybody, for is something more than merely nominal independence, and threatening not just the Republic of South Africa, but threatens the elites of independent Zambia too. And it threatens Malawi by virtue of the fact that there are some sort of social confirmations taking place in the state, but not in their own. Sorry. I'm almost done. I got one more. Let us sharpen our awareness of what is to be done in Southern Africa, as well as what is to be done in independent Africa, by recognizing that the definition of decolonization is in itself ongoing transformation. that it is becoming richer and deeper because of people's struggle, because of the life and experience of Africans in various parts of the continent. And by recognizing that, in effect, decolonization is going to be inseparable from a total strategy for liberation that encompasses a control over the material resources, which encompasses a restructuring of the society so that those who produce have the principal say in how their wealth is going to be distributed. These essentials would have to be taken into account when we consider decolonization in any part of African continent, and indeed outside, although that is not our concern at the present time. And that's the end of this book. Now, this book has tons of notes. So if you ever look at this book and you want to look at references and stuff like that, if you go to the back, it has notes. It tells you in this first section, like mass action for the exceptions of this pattern news, and it tells you where to go. And then other than that, it has all these references you all can look at in the notes to see where they got all their stuff from. And then it has index. It has an index back here. It talks about it says scientific socialism. So it talks about a whole bunch of stuff. So this book is very well done. Walter Rodney, I fear, is an underappreciated communist. I swear to God he is. I swear to God he is. Underappreciated, for sure. Finish the book. We're starting the other book tomorrow's. Sure. Walter Rodney was also assassinated for his views because he wanted to bring liberation to the very place. Plus, he was kicked out of many places because he started organizing with people. But I don't know. Maybe he was. I don't know. The ending of the transitional stages and decolonization efforts in Africa. Yeah, he said that in the book. He said at the end of the page. Yeah, some African nations are in the process in the stage of neocolonialism and imperialism. That's for sure. No worries. Anybody else have any questions? Want to come up? I'm ending it early because that's all I had to read. No one else? Yeah. Yeah. We were condescending. Huh. Yeah. Um. All right. All right. Well, anyways, if no one else has anything else to say, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Tomorrow we start how Europe under the